All right. Jai Ma. Om Mangalam Gurudevaya Devya Matriksha Mangalam Mangalam Bhakta Brindevyo Sarva Lokaya Mangalam Om Stapakaya Charamasya Sarva Dharma Sarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya Mangalam Om Sarashiva Samarambam Shankarachara Majamam Ashmarachara Prayantam Vande Gurum Paramparam Guru Brahma Guru Vishnu Guru Deva Maheshwara Guru Reva Param Brahman Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Om Bhadrakali Namo Nityam Saraswati Namo Namaha Veda Viranga Vedanta Vidyasthana Evacha Sri Ganesha Sharada Guru Vyo Namaha Hari Om Hari Om Hari Om Hari Om Hari Om. Jai Ma, good evening everyone. So we are continuing our discussion on the Devi Gita from the Srimad Devi Bhagavatam, an important Sanskrit text. 700 verses describing, actually not describing the glory of the goddess. I'm used to saying 700 verses like the Devi Mahatmya describing the glory of the goddess. 700 verses about, actually so far 46 of them have not been the 48 of them have not been the goddess speaking yet, but these are the goddess's words. This is a Devi's song, the Devi's teachings to the assembled gods headed by the Himalayas, by Himavat. So after thousands of years of tapasya, great austerities and spiritual practices, in order to get the boon, the vision, the boon of the Divine Mother, Bhubaneswari Devi, in order to get a particular boon that she be born as the spouse of Shiva, as Parvati, and so that she could have a son that could kill the demon Tarakasura. That's the backstory, as we know. But after this, all this tapasya, the Divine Mother appeared to them, first as a pillar, an infinite pillar of light, and then she took on the form of a beautiful goddess, the personal form, the personal goddess, Bhubaneswari, the mother goddess, the ruler of the universe, Bhubaneswari, the feminine ruler of the universe. And we spent a lot of time describing her iconography, showing aspects of her nature, the iconography having meaning, both as being extremely motherly, right? And motherly has all kinds of meaning. Motherly means affectionate. Mother also means the source, right? Also, mother means erotic, because from her union she manifests as as a universe. But also as Bhubaneswari, she has also the quality of being the ruler, right? So I kind of described it also a bit of the queen mother, that idea of a queen mother. So she's both the impersonal or a little bit distant ruler of the world, right, as well as the mother of the world, which is both affectionate and mother as a source and substratum, right? So all kinds of meaning that the iconography showed had hidden within it or implied within it so many aspects of this. So then the gods become overwhelmed, not knowing what to do. They get choked, tears flowing then from their eyes, the voice is choked. They inability to speak, and they pull themselves together, and then they speak. We mentioned last week, they not having what to say, not knowing what to say, they say the words of the scriptures. And so they recite these beautiful hymns that we've been discussing the last several meetings. Like I just said, these beautiful hymns, because exactly it's one hymn. They're simply praying. They're hymn to the Divine Mother. But I said beautiful hymns because the verses from these hymns come from various sources, right? That also shows a little bit of or a lot of the nature of the author, whoever the authors of this text was, metaphysically or more embodied, right? Historical authors of this text. The choice of these verses, of the verses that they choose, are very important. So there's three main sections of these verses. Actually, let me bring them up a little bit, what we've talked so far. And you can see that? Somebody wave at me that you can see that. Okay, good. So let's look at these verses. So the first, let me go back here. Just recapping what we've just go far. So struggling to regain their composure, their necks bending with devotion, their eyes brimming with tears of living joy, they glorified the world mother with hymns. Namo-Deviye Mahadeviye. We talked about these verses. So this verse, the first 5 verses that they use to praise her are found in known texts. This verse is very famous. We know it from the Chandi, from the Devi Mahatmyam, right? But it has a precedent. It has a earlier manifestation in the Atharva Shirsha, Devi Atharva Shirsha. These verses from the Atharva Veda. So I mentioned these are Atharva Veda is an important Upanishad, important Veda. But the verses from this text, from this hymn, come mostly from the Rig Veda. So these are really old verses collected. And the purpose of the Atharva Shirsha, Devi Atharva Shirsha, also known more popularly as the Devi Upanishad. We've mentioned this. I just want to bring it up because it's going to set up today's verses, right? The purpose of that text, it's hard to say the purpose of that text, right? It seems to be a very important function of that text is to introduce the collection of these different verses about the goddess, about Rigvedic verses of the goddess together in this new text, the Devi Upanishad or the Devi Atharva Shirsha, is to present the goddess present the idea of the Mahadevi. And in our goddess class, in our Hindu goddess course that we did, we talked a lot about this development of the idea of the Mahadevi. That there's not just different goddesses, right? There's also the goddess, the great goddess, right? And the Devi Gita presents a Vedic version of the great goddess, right? So including 5 verses from the Devi Upanishad in Devi Gita is also showing that Bhuneśvarīm, who's appeared to them, is the great goddess. And she is the Vedic goddess, right? That she's a goddess of the Vedas, the goddess that the Vedas praise with these beautiful verses as the Mahadevi, right? Is the same goddess that's appeared to them. So here you have, and you can say the who's Bhuneśvarīm? Is she mentioned in the Vedas by name? I can't answer that completely. I'm not immediately familiar that name gets used in Vedic texts, right? But here it's saying that so you can say Bhuneśvarīm is a Puranic goddess. She's here in the Devi Gita of the Srimad Devi Bhagavat, which is a Purana. She's also a tantric goddess. I think that's more that's safe to say. She's a local goddess. She's a folk goddess. But she's a tantric goddess, right? A Puranic goddess, a devotional goddess, a tantric goddess. But saying that this tantric goddess, the presiding main deity of the Devi Bhagavatam, is also the goddess mentioned, is a Vedic goddess, right? Showing that it has Vedic pedigree, as I mentioned last time. The great goddess, Mahadevi, and the Vedic goddess is also Bhuneśvarīm, whom they're seeing. That's important, right? So these 5 verses, I mentioned, this is one, hail to the goddess, the great goddess, the auspicious one, always hail. Hail to nature, to the propitious one, we humble ourselves attentively before her. To her, the color of fire, blazing like the sun with ascetic power, and who is worshipped for attaining the fruits of actions. To her, goddess Durga, I go for refuge. Hail to the raft of swift crossing. The gods created the goddess speech. This is the verse we talked last week. The goddess speech, Vak, right? Devi Vacham, Devi Vak. The gods created the goddess speech, whom animals or creatures of all sorts speak. This speech is pleasing to us, this cow yielding food and strength. She is well praised, may she come to us. And then the final verse we mentioned last week, we talked about last week, to Kalaratri, the 2 final verses. To Kalaratri, praised by Brahma, to Vaishnavi, to the mother of Skanda, to Saraswati, to Aditi, the daughter of Daksha, we bow to that pure, auspicious one. Connecting the Bhuneśvarīm to the Mahadevi and the Mahadevi to all these ancient manifestations of God, of the goddess or of goddesses, right? Saraswati, Aditi, daughter of Daksha means Sati, right? Like that. Durga, Vak, right? All these goddesses. And then the final, the Gayatri mantra that was used, We bow to Lakshmi, we meditate upon you, the Shakti of all, Sarva Shakti, Shakti Chadimahi Tano Devi Prachodaya, to that goddess. May that goddess illuminate our mind, illuminate and stimulate our consciousness. So the first 5 verses, establishing Bhuvaneshwari as the Mahadevi, right? The great goddess, establishing Bhuvaneshwari as the same goddess that's in the Vedas, right? That's mentioned in the Vedas. Now, these next 4 verses really is going to establish her as the goddess of Vedanta, right? Now she's a goddess of the Vedas, and now she's going to be the goddess of Vedanta specifically, not just Vedanta in its most general definition, like, you know, the goddess of the Upanishads. It's that, she's that. But it's going to be using language of the developed Advaita system of Vedanta, right? The non-dualistic school of Vedanta, the classical Advaita school, using the language. The next 4 verses will use the language and examples and metaphors of the classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara and post-Shankara, pre-Shankara, Shankara, and post-Shankara, right? It's going to use that language. I believe, and we can just say, oh, it's just doing that. That's very, and some have said it's just, that's the goal of these verses, establishing actually the one we're calling Devi, the one that you were calling Bhuvaneshwari, actually is just the non-dual, and I can't say just the non-dual Brahman, you have to be careful. I mean, non-dual Brahman is not just anything. I guess it's literally not just anything. Right? But yeah, I think you know what I mean. It's not that she is just Brahman, meaning, so of course that's fine. Okay, that we have a devotional attitude towards Brahman. Maybe that's what it means. We have, when we pray to the goddess, we're really meditating on Brahman. That's one meaning. Or it could be, and some people have held this also. This is all just of course, we can say all this is just a metaphor, right? Whether the goddess really appeared in the infinite pillar of light and took on this form, holding certain things in her hands for the gods. And why did the gods see her? Because they were kicked out of heaven. Why were they kicked out of heaven? Because Sati committed suicide in a fire, and Shiva, who's apparently the supreme absolute truth itself, became bereft of consciousness and was fainting and meditating on her and not knowing what to do. And because of this really difficult situation, right, they did thousands of years tapasya to finally get her vision. So maybe that happened. I'm not claiming that didn't happen, right? It's in the mythic conception of it, right? But you can also say, if maybe it happened literally like that, maybe this is a description of ancient actual history. You could talk about history of gods meditating for 10,000 years and goddesses committing suicide, or that it's a metaphor, right, for spiritual practice, the spiritual search and spiritualization, and therefore, and from presenting her as the goddess of Advaita Vedanta, really what this could mean, some would say, some have said, that it's just the meditation on Brahman, that the purpose of all this is not devotion necessarily, not sadhana necessarily, it's Advaitic realization, right? And to understand, and so we can investigate the way the Advaitic verses are being described here, right? Well, maybe it's that, and we bow. If it's that, we also accept that that's a wonderful contemplation. But I don't think it's just, I don't think it's that, or at least not just that, right? Because this is the Devi Gita, even the really Advaitic, the goddess who's speaking very high Advaita, here she hasn't spoken yet, but she herself will speak very high Advaita using the language of classical Advaita, right? In her own descriptions about herself, that I am Brahman, I am non-different from the self, and the highest devotion to me is not devotion, but realization of the self. And there's no difference between using that type of, she herself will use that type of language in the text. So, but the Devi Bhagavatam in general has a theology. It has a perspective, right? That complicated text, like all Puranas, but it's especially complicated. But one of the perspectives, I think, is that it is a goddess. It's a Shakta text. It's what we would call perhaps a Sanskritization of the goddess tradition. We've talked about that in our goddess course. it's using the Sanskrit tradition, the Vedic tradition, the Upanishadic tradition, in a certain, I mean, it's hard to say, but it may be to legitimize a tantric perspective, right? It's actually, I believe it's a Shakta text for sure, right? It's a Shakta text. The supreme absolute truth is not just the impersonal Brahman. It's also or primarily a goddess, right? The God, the divinity is a goddess, right? The supreme absolute truth, even Brahman, the impersonal Brahman, is a goddess, right? This is the view of, I think, of the text in general. It's heavily feminine theology, right? Goddess theology. There are versions of the same story, or version of the story. There's we've hinted at this a little bit when we talked about the sati myth that preceded the setup to this vision. There's versions of the I think there's one text. Text is not. I think it's just called the very similar to the it's not the Devi Bhagavatam, but it's something like this. It's the Srimad Bhagavat something. But there's versions of this text or this cluster of stories that's radically more goddess oriented, right? We could say a further development of the goddess tradition within this genre of Sanskrit Puranas, right? But this is the Devi Bhagavatam, the Srimad Devi Bhagavatam, where this text comes from, the Devi Gita comes from, is already a big development of the goddess theology. We'll say that goddess theology in general, Shakta theology, which has its own characteristics, and in a large sense, tantric theology, right? An aspect of tantra, and there's many aspects of tantra, and many of you already know tantra is, most forms of tantra are quite dualistic, right? And most forms of tantric are Shaivite primarily. There's Shaivite tantra, there's Vaishnava tantra, and there's Shakta tantra. There's also Buddhist tantra and Jain tantra and things like that also. But generally, we think of tantra is Shakta, Shaivite, and Vaishnava. Of the three, most tantra is Shaivite, and of Shaivite tantra, most of it's dualistic, right? But this strand of tantra, of Shakta tantra, right, focused on the goddess, is non-dualistic in orientation. It's an Advaitic system. So that's why these verses today that we're going to do are going to be using the language of Advaita. But it's not, I don't believe it's exactly the Advaita. It's using the language of the classical Advaita, of Shankara and his successors, right, and followers, of Sarananda and like this. But I don't think it's that, right? It's a different form of Advaita. It's a Shakta Advaita, and I believe also this is closer to the worldview, the theocentric or theocentric or goddess-centric view of Sri Ramakrishna, and his version. If we would call Sri Ramakrishna's teaching Vedanta, philosophically Vedanta, you can call it Vedanta if you'd like. It's not my preferred way to describe Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, but there's sophisticated arguments right now, like Ayan Maharaj and Vijnana Vedanta and the like. If you call his system Vedanta, philosophical system Vedanta, it could be not dissimilar to the Vedanta that is being described in today's verses. So let's look at those verses. Let's see where we are here. I'm going to share the screen again. Okay. So this is, we're in chapter 1 still, verse 49. Hopefully we'll do 49 and 50 today. There's only 3 more verses or 4 more verses, and the Devi finally speaks. We'll get to hear her voice. To give you a hint, if you haven't read forward, if you haven't read a few verses ahead, or if you haven't heard the goddess speak to you, right, it's going to sound the voice like a cuckoo bird, right? The beautiful voice of a cuckoo bird, as it's described very beautifully. So they continue their prayer. Namo-virāṭ-svarūpiṇyai namaḥ sūtrātma-mūrtaye. Namo-vyākṛta-rūpiṇyai namo śrī-brahma-mūrtaye. So now it's what's repeated 4 times. Let's make sure it's 4 times is namo, namaha, I bow, we bow, right? So already this is a devotional stance. All these verses so far have been in verses of praise, right? And who are they? We have to remember, who are they praising? They're praising the Bhuvaneshwari, supreme goddess, and whom they're seeing, right? So that's important. Without this, the poetic setup that they're seeing the goddess, their eyes are, streams of tears are flowing from their eyes, overwhelmed by what they've seen or what they're seeing. They're doing these prayers. We have to remember that, because these prayers are full of abstract Advaita philosophy, right? But it's not abstract to them, right? This is their experience, right? This is what they're seeing. They're responding, giving language to what they're seeing in the text as it is, right? In the story of the text, the literature of the text. Namo-virāṭ-svarūpiṇyai, right? Virat means the so let's look at see, we're using primarily as our foundational translation that of C. Mackenzie Brown. We haven't shown the book in a while, but he's a professor, scholar, and who specializes in Puranas and specializes in Shakta Puranas, and especially specializes in Devi Bhagavatam and Devi Gita. She's on also important books, work on other aspects, other Shakta Puranas, as well as other topics also, but this is a main, and this book is really good because it has a decent translation. Translation is always a translation, but I think it's a good, clean translation. There's commentary, scholarly commentary, but it's meant for like intelligent students, not necessarily, you have to necessarily be it's not an academic commentary, although there's academic notes attached to the commentary, and these are very valuable for those who want to study this text. There's not much other resource material on the Devi Gita, nothing like this. So it's one of the reasons we're giving this class, is because this text is so wonderful that it needs more. So it needs more discussion. So we appreciate so we're using primarily his translation. Namo-virāṭ. So he says, hail to her in the form of the cosmic body. Hail to her in the form of the cosmic soul. Hail to her in the unmanifested state. Hail to her in the form of the glorious Brahman. So the punchline at the end is Brahman, right? So this is introducing her as the Brahman of Advaita. But let's look at the verse before, actually, and it's using, I'm going to jump in a moment. We'll show how these four lines, these four hails, are the classical fourfold aspects of Brahman, called the in my notes I got lost today, Chaturpada Brahma, I think it's called, right? The 4 feet of the 4 aspects of Brahma. So that it's showing that the one absolute truth has 4 aspects of realization or manifestation or conception. But let's not, we'll go to that momentarily. Let's look at it just as a devotional hymn, right? Without the layer of philosophical interpretation to which language it's using. So we have to go to that, but let's look at it just as a devotional hymn. Namo-virāṭ-svarūpiṇyai. What is swarup? Rupa means form, right, or body, right? It could also mean essence, of the nature of, right? So virāṭ-svarūpa and swa also. So if it said virat means universal, all pervading, cosmic. He says the cosmic body, right? So namo, we bow to the one who, in the form of the cosmos. The whole universe, the manifested universe, is her body. That body, the Virat Purusha, Virat Rupa, is her form. Swarūpiṇyai, right? So whose swa means one's own, whose own, her own, right? So that means we're bowing to your own form, which is the universe. So we can say like that, this universe is her form, her body. Right, and this is not an illegitimate interpretation of this verse, because some chapters later she will show her Virat, her cosmic form, her cosmic body, her body as a universe. This is the reason I chose on this piece of art that the graphic to go along with it. Forgive me, I tried to always say who the artist is. I didn't have today. I could find her artist. If anybody knows the artist, you can put it in the comments or something. It's an SRF. It was made for an SRF book. The artist has come to Kalima. That's why I'm embarrassed I don't remember. I've met the artist. She's come here before, a couple of times before, and she mentioned that she had made this, and it's based on a yantra, and she gave all the details. It was commissioned for an SRF book. The beautiful paint. I love this painting, right? Showing that this universe is her form, right? The Virāṭ Purusha, Virāṭ Rupa. But Svarupa also means it's the nature of, right? So it's that this form, her nature is also this, not her form, this body, the universe is her body, but also the universe is made of her essence. We can say it like that. And then the next verse, the next line, namo-sūtrātma-mūrtaye. So he's translated as the cosmic soul, right? So you have the body, the cosmic body, the stuff of the universe, the items within the universe itself, made of all items. This is her body, but also she's within the universe. Sūtrātma actually means, Atma means self or inner nature, and Sutra means thread, right? So Sūtrātma is like I always have beads with me, right? So I have a bunch of beads, and in between each bead, there's a thread. There's a thread that holds it all together. The essence of the mala is the thread. So within every bead, right, the physical bead, there is some subtle thing hidden within that string. There's a verse actually in my notes I got lost. I had it typed out, but I know the verse. It's 7:7. In the Bhagavad Gita from the Mahabharata. There is nothing. Krishna says there is nothing whatsoever higher than me, O Dhananjaya. All this is strung on me as rows of gems on a string, right? What's the term here? Sutre-manigana, right? That all, just like everything is strung on me, just like beads on gems or beads on a string. This Sūtrātma, even for in my own monastic lineage, our Dashnami sannyasi tradition, there's a category of Upanishads called the Sannyasa Upanishads, that are meant that give the details and rules for like a super orthodox Upanishadic based sannyas. So orthodox, none of us, I don't know anybody who can possibly follow the orthodox principles of it. But like, for instance, there's a justification for in certain forms of sannyas, we cut off the sacred thread. And then he says, well, how can you cut off the sacred thread? The thread, how can you do any sadhana without the sacred thread? How can you study scriptures without the sacred thread? That's a great fall down from the Vedic tradition. You're rejecting the Vedas. He goes, no. The actual knowing Sūtrātma, that is wearing the sacred thread. Knowing the thread to which within everything, the thread on which everything is strung. To know the self within all things, the subtle within the gross, that is the sacred thread. One who knows that is the wearer of the sacred thread. Therefore, a sannyasi who knows that is wearing the real sacred thread. This is a typical language of the Sannyasa Upanishad. The real sacred thread is knowing the thread, the self, which is a thread within everything, the subtle part within everything. That type of rhetorical language is used. So the Sūtrātma within the inner, the self that's within subtly, right? So here it says, so she's the cosmic body, her cosmic body, hail to her in the form of the subtle Atman, the Atman within the cosmic body. So if we were to use a language of Sankhya, we'd say the hail to her who's in the form of Prakriti, right? And hail to the form of Purusha. You could choose that type of language. But this isn't, we're not using that type of language because the Prakriti and Purusha are different. She is both, in this verse, this is what they're saying, she is both Prakriti and she's Purusha. She's both the body and she's the soul. She's both matter and she's spirit. She's both, let's use something that partakes of both, uses the distinction of Sankhya, but in more classical Advaitic form. She's both the subject and the object. She's awareness and what she's aware and what awareness shines upon and realizes, right? She's a subject and the object, because the objects are gross and the subject is subtle, right? So she's the gross and the subtle, right? So anyway, this is beautiful. I mean, I think that this is a very profound, right? It's not like we bow to her who's the essence of everything, of a world that doesn't exist. We bow to her who is this world, right? And we bow to her who is within this world, right? Sri Ramakrishna has this beautiful story. For example, he says, like a spider and its web. A spider creates a web out of itself, right? Creates this world and then lives in the web. So the Divine Mother has made this world out of herself and then lives in the world, right? She's both the contain, and then he even says she's both the container and the contained, right? That she's both in this. I believe one way we can interpret this verse, she's both Virāṭ Swarupa and sūtrātma-mūrtaye or Murti, right? So here, another word, so there's sūtrātma-mūrtaye, Murti. Murti means image or form, more solid than Rupa. Rupa could mean, Swarupa, the nature of. Murti is more the image, which is so interesting. Her form is sūtrātma. We bow to her whose nature is this material world, Virāṭ, and who's within the material world, the subtle essence, right? So next half line, Namo, and so the sun, it's interesting because I've seen some translation and even my own when I was typing it out in the notes that I lost. My original thing, I was saying, Mackenzie Brown seems to have gotten it wrong completely, right? Namo-vyākṛta, right? Vyakrita means that one who manifests, but it's not. But because of, you see that and the not apostrophe, I guess apostrophe or something like this, right? The marking. This is due to something. It's actually namaḥ-avyākṛta, right? Not which manifests, that which is unmanifested, right? So I figured he must be right, and I'm not the right one, he's not, but sometimes we can see. But so we bow to her, right? Rūpiṇyai, and yoi is feminine, so we're bowing to her, right? It's calling out to her, bowing to her, or respecting her, a feminine form. Namo-vyākṛta, she who is unmanifested, right? So this is interesting. So she is the manifested universe, right? The Virāṭ. She's a subtle essence within the Virāṭ, the cosmic soul, as he pronounces it, as he describes it, the subtle essence, the Atma, and the consciousness within the body, the self within the universe, like this, right? And she's also the avyākṛta, which means she's unmanifested. She's what we may see in kind of sloppy Advaitic language, she's the impersonal Brahman, something like this, right? She's the absolute, right? I have a little hard time calling that the absolute because the Virāṭ is also absolute and the Sūtrātma is also absolute. The absolute, one thing you can see, this is an interesting thing. This is a problem of how Vedanta and the Indian tradition has come down to us in most of our lineages. Most people in our group here, I know most of our lineages, this is how it come down to it. We think, we have devotion to God who is form, or the personal God, or we have an orientation towards the absolute God, the absolute truth, meaning Brahman, right? And it could mean that these verses could be pointing to that, right? But I think actually these verses are saying, or this is how we see these verses say, we bow to the absolute, which is the Virāṭ, the Sūtrātma, and the Avyākṛta, which is both the absolute, which appears as who manifests as the universe, the subtle soul of the universe, and is the unmanifested part, right? The unchanging, the unchanging, and the witness of it all, or something like however you want to describe these three things. So namo-vyākṛta-rūpiṇyai, in the form of the Avyākṛta and the unmanifested. Namaḥ śrī-brahma-mūrtaye. We bow to, it says Brahma-mūrtaye. So in the form of Brahman, So it's interesting now, does Brahman have form? Right. So so if it's a murti is quite the word for form, right? Or shape or image, right? So the image, so is this a mistake that this is the murti is the wrong word for Brahman, right? Brahman is impersonal or unmanifested or unchanging, advaita, non-dual. It's true in its true form, right? So maybe in emotion they used the wrong word. They didn't use the wrong word. They're looking at her, right? Let's interpret it from within the text itself. They're looking at her form, right? This form they're looking at is Brahman. This form they're looking at is the Virat, the universe, everything in this universe. This form they're looking at is the self of the universe. This form they're looking at is that which is beyond, unmanifested, unchanging, the unchanging aspect, right? As well as Brahma itself. And so it says śrī-brahma-mūrtaye, right? He's translated as glorious. It's a beautiful translation, I think. The glorious Brahman, right? Shri means glorious, respected, beautiful, like this, right? But Shri is also a quality, all those qualities of glory and shining and happiness and beauty and all the things, respect, that are implied by the word Shri, they don't stand on their own. These are qualities of the goddess, right? Shri is the quality of the goddess, the auspicious, beautiful, glorious quality of the goddess. It's also the name of the goddess, or name of a goddess, right? It's a name it's one of the names of Lakshmi, right? And the names of the goddess are usually chosen or represent some aspect of her. Her qualities create her names. We know her by the name, by her qualities. One of her qualities is Shri. I'm remembering the voice of Baba Rampuri. I don't know if you know, he's a famous Naga Baba who's written some interesting books. But he says that her name is auspiciousness, right? In other words, her name is Shri, right? Her name is auspicious, prosperity, wealth, flowing rivers, fields of grass, of wheat, and like this. This is Shri. This is her nature. That Brahman is the goddess. That Brahman has the qualities of the goddess, which are glory, beauty, happiness, respect, fame, all the things represented by Shri. śrī-brahma-mūrtaye namaḥ. So that's the first swipe at these verses, right? Just take them as they are. And this is how, when I read these verses, these two verses, this and the next verse, you'll hear me say, "Oh, these are my favorite verses in the whole text." But these are part of my favorite verses of the whole text, right? Even though Ma hasn't spoken yet, I think these are so important. We bow to her who is the universe, the world. We bow to her as within the universe, the world who is beyond the universe, and we bow to her who is the supreme Brahman. But that Brahman is glorious. That Brahman has luster, right? The śrī-brahma-mūrtaye, another term, Swami Lakshmanju, the great master of Kashmir Shaivism, he used to say that Shiva and his splendor, right? So that this world, he says, he'd say it was tears in his eyes, just like the gods did in this thing, tears rolling down. This is the splendor of God, right? That God is splendorous. To put that in proper Shakta tantric theological format, the absolute truth is dynamic, right? The reality is intrinsically, we've talked about this before, this is a very good working definition of Shaktism, I believe, that the absolute truth, the reality is intrinsically dynamic, right? Some schools of thought, and even the school of thought that the language that these verses are using, the pure classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara's version of Advaita Vedanta, believes that the absolute truth is intrinsically not dynamic, and that what we see as the dynamic manifestation of the world is due to ignorance, right? Where we misunderstand it. The next verse is going to say that. We'll see. But But thinking this, that Sri Brahma, the glorious Brahman with Sri, or quality of Brahman as Sri, non-different from Sri, may mean that the absolute truth is intrinsically dynamic, and therefore, anyway, we'll get ahead of myself. So that's my first swipe, right? This is the way I have caressed these verses for many, many years, right? I love these verses. They represent like that. This is the way I tend to see, although we can switch systems. I can switch to an Advaitic hat and then see the world through the Advaitic Shankara's Advaita Darshana, no problem, right? But that's not my normal comfortable place, right? This is my normal comfortable place. This is, I believe, the place that Sri Ramakrishna also taught. He used the term, Swami Bhajanananda will maybe read a few verses after this, after we get into the next verse of, actually Thakur didn't use the term, but M defines some of Thakur's teachings as Kali Brahman. Not Kali Brahman, maybe similar to Śrī Brahman, right? Śrī Brahman and Kali Brahman, that Kali, Brahman and Kali, Brahman and Shakti, Brahman and Śrī are not different, are inseparable, are the same. Two aspects of the same thing, perhaps, something like this. So, but I mentioned that this is using the language of classical Advaita, the Upanishadic Advaita. So it was in my notes, I have to remember it, which I lost. Mandukya Upanishad, in the Mandukya Upanishad, I believe, it mentions the four, this Chaturpad, I think it's Chaturpad Brahma, the four quality, the four parts of Brahman, if you could say four parts of Brahman. And they are the Vaishvanara, or the Vishwa. This corresponds to a state of consciousness of our waking state. Then there is the Taijasa. This is our dreaming state of when we're dreaming. Prajna, which is deep sleep or dreamless sleep. Durga. There's a bunch of sirens going by. Durga. And in Chaturati. So these are we'll mention these first three: the Vaishvanara, Taijasa, Prajna, and Prajna. These are the waking state, the dreaming state, and the deep sleep or dreamless sleep state. So our mind, usually we're conscious mostly of the three. We're in our waking state of consciousness that manifests through this physical body. In our waking body, we have our dreaming state. We have a different body, with a subtle body, some subtle type thing. We have a different world, the dream world, right? And then the dreamless sleep. And even in dreamless sleep, it says that we experience, there's a great bliss in dreamless sleep also, right? That's why if we don't get dreamless sleep, we don't wake up rested. And we need dreamless sleep. We need to regenerate, right? And we the scripture says that we touch the self during dreamless sleep, but we do it asleep. So we do it in tamaguna. So we wake up my Guruji used to say, he used to use the four states of consciousness all the time in his discussions. This was his personal experience. He says, we wake up the same fool we went to sleep, even though we've been immersed in the self, but we wake up the same fool because we've done it unconsciously. We can do it consciously through meditation, not losing our consciousness, go into the dreamless sleep type of state. It's another state. So beyond these three states of consciousness, there is a fourth state called the Chaturti. Chaturti means the fourth state, Chatura, right? And by convention, Chatur has been dropped, and so Chaturti, that Turti becomes Turiya. And so you probably know this word Turiya. Turiya means to transcend. So Turiya means a transcendental state. That means a state beyond the three states, or independent of the three states. The fourth state, which is a transcendent state of the three states. So waking, dreaming, dreamless sleep, waking, dreaming, dreamless sleep. We rotate within the three. Where do the three exist in? They exist in these three states of consciousness, exist within a field of consciousness, chaturthi, the fourth state, the non-dual state, right? In that non-dual state, so the waking, dreaming, and dreamless sleep are aspects, or certain sense, or experiences, or manifestations of the fourth state. The fourth state, the transcendent state, the substratum, maybe that's in a better language, the substratum from which these three exist. Can we ever see it? My Guruji used to say, Swami Bhajanananda Saraswati, his style, he says, when we move between states, between waking and dreaming, it's like there's little tiny gaps. The transition, those transitions, you can catch glimpses of the Turiya state, right? This is a secret, and there's all kinds of techniques where people are trying to catch gaps between, not only between states of consciousness, or which is hard to do, to catch the consciousness between sleep and dream, for instance, or dream and dreamless sleep. Very hard to do that consciously, right? But maybe it's also difficult, but easier to do between two thoughts, between two words, between two breaths, between two anythings. All things exist within that substratum of the chaturthi, the fourth state. So these four states, the waking, dreaming, dreamless sleep, dreamless sleep, and transcendental state, or the independent state, the foundational state, correspond to these four aspects that are being bowed to. We bow to her as Virat, right? So the Vaishvanara, the Vishwa, is also known as the Virat. That means in waking state, what do we see? We see the external world, the Virat, right? In dream state, in the Taijasa state, we live in the subtle world, the sutra world, the sūtrātma world. So sūtrātma is a reference to the dream experience, right? And the prajna, deep sleep, is where we don't experience anything. This is the unmanifested world, right? This is the avyākṛta. And then the chaturthi, the fourth state, is that of Brahman, the non-dual Brahman, right here, namo-virāṭ-svarūpiṇyai. So this is using the language of this Upanishad and later developed Advaitic school, right? That she is these four states, right? Or she manifested these four states, right? So that's another way of looking at it, and it's using that language. We have to look at it this way. We have to see that, right? But I really do. Maybe I hope, but I do feel also, right, that's using that language, but in a way that's more devotional and more shakta, right? That we see she's the four states. That's fine, but she's also the world. She's the essence of the soul. She's beyond the world, and she's the glorious Brahman, which is both dual and non-dual, and manifest and unmanifest, and form and formless. She's a Shri-Murti, Shakti Murti. She's Shakti and Brahman combined. śrī-brahma-mūrtaye namaḥ. Brahman, also Shri is the qualities of the goddess, these divine qualities. She's Brahman with She's Brahman with qualities, right? What are the qualities? She's Brahman with qualities and Brahman without qualities. So we can say it like that. So how do we say? So the language of Advaita Vedanta that's being used here is the arguments being used, and the next verse is really going to use the classic example of the snake and the rope, which many of you know. We'll jump into it just now. Your timer, okay. There's many competing philosophical, theological perspectives in Vedanta and Tantra and different things like this, right? We can say this is a slight conflict, maybe a big conflict between two of them, right? And maybe some people hold, I've been told that this level of development and of the Devi Bhagavatam doesn't know which one it is. It could be, I believe it does know which one it is, right? But it uses the language of both. So one is parinamavad. Maybe you've heard this term. It's a technical term, parinamavad, and the other is vivartavad. Vad is the teachings, particular school of thought, the teachings of something, right? Parinama means evolution, right? Or maybe we could say, I think evolution is a proper translation. Maybe I usually think of transformation, right? That parinamavad, what is this world? Who are we? What is everything? It has evolved out of Brahman. Brahman has become the world. Brahman has become us. Brahman has become what has become? Virāṭ, sūtrātma, right? Has become the world and living beings. Or Jiv and Jagat, right? The world has become the world and living beings, right? That is parinamavad. Where it exists, it's made. This is the idea of Ramakrishna's description of the spider creating the world out of itself, right? Where did the world come from? It's Brahman. Brahman has become the world, right? There is the competing philosophical stance. Vivartavad means what's the proper definition of vivarta? Appearance. Maybe that's right. The world appears, right? It's not actually Brahman. Brahman didn't become the world. The world actually doesn't exist. It appears to exist, right? So that's the competing school, right? And the language of these verses is that of the Vivartavad, right? The next verse especially, which we'll read just now, right? But there's slight differences, and Professor Mackenzie Brown uses there's actually, if you have the translation with commentary, I read the commentary or the notes, not the commentary, the note on these two verses, right? Because he gives his argument for this. Let's look at the verse, and then we'll see what he does. Okay. So I'll read the translation first, right? Through her power of ignorance, she shows herself as the world, like a rope appearing as a serpent, wreath, and the like. Through her power of knowledge, she dissolves the world back into herself. We glorify her, the ruler of the universe. This is the verse, right? And so it's using the classic example of the Vivarta school, right? A lot of sirens. I hope everything's okay in the neighborhood. Durga. And I'll read. There's the Vedanta Sada of Sadhananda. This is a very famous description, a distillation, an argument of this school of thought. And there's a chapter titled Superimposition. And verse 1 of this title says, Ajya-rūpa is the superimposition of the unreal on the real. The unreal is superimposed on the real, right? Like the false perception of a snake in a rope, which is not a snake. So, and the example given in so many texts will tell a little story. Imagine you're walking at sunset in twilight time when things are neither dark nor light, right? And also imagine in India, the #1 cause of accidental death, is, as far as I know, is still snake bite, right? Poisonous snake bite, right? So people are scared of snakes, legitimately so. If you live in a place that's snake prone, and people die from snake bite all the time. So you're conscious of snake, you're looking for snakes, right? And in that, you're walking in the dark and you see coiled in the corner, you're looking, I hope there's no snakes, and you see a snake coiled in the corner, right, on the road, and you get scared. Oh my God, a snake! Oh my God, a snake! Right? Your heart beats, and you think you're going to die, and you're like this, right? But then let's say somebody turns on the light, or the street light comes on, or you investigate, or have to go kill that snake so it doesn't bite me or the children or something like that, and you go and you realize, oh, it was just coiled rope, right? It was a rope coiled like a snake. And you go, oh, it was never a snake. It was always a rope. So what happened to the snake? The snake was never there, right? You saw a snake that wasn't there, right? And so that verse from the Vedanta Sada, you see a snake in a rope that was never a snake. So you see a world in Brahman that was never a world. This is the school of I mean, there's all these technical terms. They're not fresh in my mind, and also like I had some of them written down in my notes to remind me that my memory is not the same. But I in my own language, I almost call it like a harsh Advaita, right? Or like a harsh view of the world, right? That the world really is not real, not like it's not what we think it is. That way, it's not real, or we don't see it properly. If we saw it properly, there's never been a snake there. It was always a rope. There's never been a world. There's always been only Brahman, right? So that's the classic example, the classic story, right? So here it says, like a rope appearing as a serpent, wreath, and the like. It adds actually another item, serpent. Let's see, where are the words here? Raju, it says yaj-ajñanāj-jagad-bhāti. Raju means rope, right? Sarpa means snake, and where is that? And srajat means like he says wreath, or like a mala, or a garland, something like that. So you can see. So it's actually very unclear. He whether it's a rope appearing like you see a rope and you think, oh, maybe it's a snake, or you think it's a garland, right? But it's not clear, because actually simply it says, through her power of ignorance, she shows herself like a rope, snake, and garland, right? It doesn't say like a rope appearing like a snake or garland. It simply mentions snake, rope, snake, garland, right? So most likely it means, and he's translated, like a rope appearing like a serpent or garland, right? But it doesn't say that, right? So we have to think that maybe it's not fully exactly saying that, may allow for a classic recognizable example to be being used differently, perhaps differently. So through her power of ignorance, she shows herself as the world, like a rope appearing as a serpent, wreath, or snake. This verse, when I say, oh, this is one of my favorite verses, this really is one of my favorite verses, right? And just this first half line. The second half is just as good, but this first half line really impressed me when I first read it many, many years ago. That made me inspired originally to speak on the Devi Gita many, many years ago, when I first gave my first attempt at public speaking, was a class on the Devi Gita, inspired by his translation of this verse, right? And I've quoted this many, many times in so many classes, saying, oh, the Devi Gita says, right, kind of a different interpretation of the snake rope analogy, right, with a different point, right? And I've always I hope it actually says that, because I've committed so much energy and interpretive energy on this view. I think it does say that, and working with this verse the last few days more carefully with Swami Bhajanananda, and looking at his own justification for how he translated the verse, I think it could say like that, although it doesn't have to be interpreted this way. What's the difference? In the Vedanta Sada, let's look at this verse again. The superimposition, the unreal and the real, like the false perception of a snake and a rope. So the problem is, out of ignorance, we don't see the right thing, and therefore we see the wrong thing. The problem is our problem. The ignorance is in us, right? But here it says, she shows, through ignorance, she shows herself as a snake, as the world, right? She shows herself as so the rope shows itself as a snake. That's why I've chosen this picture, right? I love this. It came on, it's like on the internet, on somebody's Facebook years ago or something like that, and I've saved it I've saved it probably 30 times on my phone. Every time I see it, just in case I don't have it. I think it's such a great image, because that rope looks a lot like a snake, right? It's not our absolute ignorance. It's not our fault that we see a snake-shaped rope like a snake, because it looks a lot like a snake, right? And so the rope shows itself as a snake. She shows herself as a world, not that we see a world in her. That's not there, right? If there's a mistake, whose fault is it, right? This is an interesting thing. Is it our fault? We can say like that. Obviously, we think, oh, we have to learn ignorance like that. Whose ignorance, right? It's through her power of ignorance. It says agnayat, it through her own power, through her ignorance, she shows herself. So it could just say, oh, she's showing herself, but there really is no world. If the snake represents the world, and the rope is Brahman, as the classical example, right? Maybe it's her action, not our fault, but still, it's not a world. It's not a world. It's only Brahman. It's not a snake. It's only a rope. Maybe, right? It's like, if we see a world, she shows herself for the world. Connecting with the previous verse, namo, what is it? I already forgot it. Namo-virāṭ-svarūpiṇyai. We bow to her who is the world, right? Maybe she shows herself for the world, and that the power by she does that, this is called avidya, or agyana, here agyana. Sri Ramakrishna used this term avidya, vidyamaya and avidyamaya, right? The power of knowledge and the power of ignorance. By the power of ignorance, we see the many. By the power of knowledge, we see the one, right? It doesn't mean the many is not there, right? Her power, and so this gets a little bit complicated in how we define the word Maya. Here being used agyana, ignorance, right? Gyan and gyan here in these parallel, in this two halves of a verse. By agyana, you show yourself for the world. By agyana, you merge. The world disappears into you, merges into you, like this, dissolves into you, right? In classical language, we often say this is Maya. Right? What is Maya? By Maya, we see the world. So Maya means mistake. That's one definition, right? But also Maya is also a power. In certain schools, and in the Shakta and Tantric schools of Shakta schools of Tantra, let's say like that, that's a very common thing, that Maya is not just a mistake. Maya is a power of Brahman, a power of Devi, who is Brahman, śrī-brahma-mūrtaye, right? A power of Brahman to delude, right? So we can say to delude, or let's say it less harshly, power to manifest. So the one to appear as many. What does it mean? When there's only one, how could the one appear as many? There has to be some trick in itself, right? For the subject, and as the subject to simply be conscious, for consciousness, if it's not conscious of anything, if there's nothing to be conscious of, it's not conscious. It has to be conscious of something. So there has to create some limit, some object for it to reflect its own awareness, right? This is a basic idea of Shaktism, right? The absolute Brahman, if Brahman is the absolute, in order to be itself, has to create a world, has to create objects that are none other than itself. Are they really objects? They're not really objects, they're really itself. There's really the subject appearing objectified, right? So the ignorance, by maybe she causing our ignorance, we see the world wrong, or by just the general nature of the nature of the subject-object relationship creates a world like this, right? But she shows herself as a world, right? As a rope appearing, as serpent, wreath, and the like, right? We can say like that. This listing, not saying directly showing herself as a rope appearing as a serpent, wealth, or wreath, it really says through her power of ignorance, she shows, that's another thing, important word. I don't have my word for word here. This Jagat-bhāti, that's very important. I shouldn't skip it. That's a beautiful line. Jagat means world, right? Bhati means shining. right? Bhati means shining. Also, bhati means revealing oneself as, or seen as, or revealing oneself as, right? So she shows herself, she, through her power of ajnana, she shines as the world, right? Such an interesting, this is the choice of language is so interesting. But she reveals, you could say reveals herself as the world, but that bhati is such a, it's a very dignified word. It's a shiny word, right? It's so she shows herself, shines as the world, right? But maybe, and this is, I believe this is one of the moves that if we could say Shakta Advaita or Kali Brahma Shakta Vedanta holds. It's not that it's not just that the real reality is the rope and the falsehood is the snake or the wreath, right? The reality is her who shows herself as snake, rope, and wreath, right? This is the big statement. She shows herself as rope. So in the story, Brahman, right? The absolute, impersonal, however you like that, or as a world, or any like that. So she's a substratum of both Brahman and its manifestation, right? Kali Brahman or śrī-brahma-mūrtaye in this verse, in the previous verse, right? So like we often think like, oh, and it's a practice in Vedantic types of sadhana to make a distinction between object and subject, right? The observer and the object observed, right? It's not, and we think, oh, Brahman, the self is the observer and the object is not the self, right? And so that's okay. That's the type of sadhana neti idea, right? That's not exactly true either, right? We would say in the Shakta tradition that the truth manifests as both the seer and the seen, as the subject and the object, right? So similarly, we would say, perhaps, this is the bold move, right? That the reality manifests, right? When it manifests as both the observer and the observed, as the seen and the unseen, or in the previous verse, the viraṭ, the sūtrātma, and the namo-vyākṛta, right? The world, the self in the world, and the unchanging source or substratum, right? It's all those things together. That is Brahman. That is the absolute truth, here called Devi, right? Through her power, through ajnana, she shows herself as the world of rope, serpent, and wreath, or interpretation. And through her power of knowledge, here's this jnana, to jnanat, jnanayat, right? She dissolves the world back into herself. Laya, right? So that's also, that gets into the more Shakta type of, this is a Shakta text, you have to admit that, right? It's an Advaitic Shaktic text, right? This is a classic form of Advaitic Shaktic philosophy. What happens to the world? It comes out of Brahman, or comes out of Devi, who is not different from Brahman, and goes back into her, right? In the Vavyartic type of perspective, when you see the unreal snake on a real superimposed on a real rope, and when one sees the rope, what happens to the snake? It dissolves. Where does it dissolve? It dissolves into the rope. So that language is still legitimate, right? The world would dissolve into Brahman in the dawning of when you know what Brahman is, and you know you're Brahman, you know there's only Brahman, the world and the individual merges into Brahman, disappears into Brahman, and you realize what you're always seeing is only Brahman. But that school, you're only seeing Brahman, that's never changed, right? This is viraṭ-svarūpiṇyai, right? Who's also the world, who has changed. Maybe this is parinama, right? Who has become the world and who dissolves the world. And we see you as the world, and we also see you within the world, sūtrātma, right? And so the classic example that I like, this helps me a lot, and Advaitic schools also use a similar argument, but they use it slightly differently, example, like differently, of like when you look at a wave, and a wave is nothing but water, right? And of course, the wave, you could say, oh, the wave comes out of the ocean and goes back into the ocean. That's true, right? But the wave is nothing but ocean. It's nothing but water. And you could see the wave and you could see, oh, what a powerful wave. It must be made of water, fine. But if you see the water, the wave seems to disappear, right? It's like, or the example of, I don't have gold. I guess my ring is gold. My puja ring is gold, right? So I can see this ring, a beautiful ring of gold, right? But if I see just the gold, the ring disappears, right? It merges the gold. Where did the ring go? The ring ran into the gold. The ring is temporary. The gold is eternal, and so that's a major distinction between different schools, the philosophical schools. What's defined as real in the classical Advaita Vartavad school? Real means that which doesn't change, right? In the Parinamavad school, these are general statements, and people can push back at me, but I'm just making general statements, not specific statements, right? Real is what exists. Is the substance is real, its forms change. Doesn't mean the forms are unreal. That just means they're temporary. Temporariness is not a sign of unreality. It's just a change, the change of the reality. And if the reality is that things change, right, the substance may not change, but the forms and names change. And therefore the forms and names are real. They're real names and forms of an unchanging reality, right? So we don't have to dismiss it as unreal, but we still have to mark them as temporary, right? And so I think that's still important. Just because temporary does not mean unreal. Temporary means temporary. Temporary changes within time of the unchanging substratum. Perhaps this is one way to look at it, right? What does it say? Through her power of knowledge, through jnana, right, she dissolves the world back into herself. There's a beautiful mantra for Lalita Tripura Sundari, Laeshwari. Shri Vidya Jagadatrim Stristi Stiti Laeshwarim. Shri Vidya Jagadatrim, O Shri Vidya, O Goddess Tripura Sundari, the goddess of knowledge, Stristi Stiti, you are creator, sustainer, and dissolver. The world comes out of you, exists for a while within you, and dissolves into you. In the Chandi, in the Devi Mahatmya, we have a similar verse. What is it? Stristi Stiti Vinashini, right? It's a little hard. It is Kali and Durga, right? The creator, sustainer, and destroyer, right? That's a harsher word, right? This is in literature, but Sundari use it Laeshwari, the one who dissolves everything. Everything dissolves back into you, dissolves the universe, right? So this is this type of language, that the Laya, right? Who dissolves the world back into her, both cosmically and also in realization. When we see her, the world merges into her, and we see only her. And so this is one way the sages have spoken, the devotional saints have spoken, that they see only God. I've heard people say this, maybe you've read people say that, I've heard people directly say this. People see a world, I see only God, right? But that means that you don't see, if I were to hand you this portable typing thing, no, of course, if you hand the Swami or the saint the something, he'd grab it, he sees it, but he sees it, but he sees only God, right? It's not like he sees it and everything disappears because he sees only God, right? That he doesn't see a keyboard, he doesn't see a ring, he doesn't see, he sees everything, but he sees the one within everything, and everything in one sense disappears, right? He sees everything merges back into herself, and you see only her, one way. And then it says, O Bhuvaneshwari, numastāṃ Bhuvaneshwari. We praise you, we glorify her, who? The goddess Bhuvaneshwari, the goddess of this text, the goddess who's appeared, the ruler, and this means the ruler of the world, the transcendent ruler of the world, the feminine power, Bhuvaneshwari, the goddess, supreme goddess controller of the world. And we were talking, because I'm not so good at grammar and the like, and these distinctions in grammar, but we always have to think, there's a subject of the sentence, right? Who is it pointing to? It's referring to Bhuvaneshwari. So all these things are her qualities. the subject matter of the verse is the world, about ignorance creating a world. We see a world and presenting herself of the world, and through knowledge, the world disappears back into her. That's the subject matter. But the subject, who is being described, right? All these are epithets, glorifications, realizations, the descriptions of the goddess, right? Not just of Brahman, but of śrī-Brahman, right? Or Kali Brahman, like this, of the goddess like this, right? So through her power of knowledge, she dissolves the world back into herself. We glorify her, the ruler of the universe. The next two verses we'll discuss next week. We'll go flesh that out, and using other classic examples taken from the Upanishads and Vedic tradition, but maybe used for the to present this Shakta Advaita philosophy that seems to be, it claim here that it's Vedic, it's Vedantic, and it's non-dual, but it's using the language of the Vedas, Vedanta, and Advaita, right? But slightly different, right? It's not it doesn't seem to be the classic Advaita of Shankara and his followers, right? That's that trend of thought, right? It's something different. It's Shaktism. It's Shakta Advaita. So I'm excited about these verses because it puts the whole thing on the goddess. And where goddess, I can see it in different ways also. I have no problem changing hats and seeing through different darshanas, different views. To me, the different views aren't fighting with, they are fighting with each other, but they're not fighting within me. I'm not trying to fight for one and argue against another one. I don't really prefer that type of, that's not my temperament. Maybe it is my temperament. I'm trying to control my temperament, not to be so argumentative, right? And take that fanatical stance and argue from the perspective. I appreciate all the perspective, but this perspective is, to me, the very spiritually mature perspective. I believe it's the perspective of Sri Ramakrishna, more or less, right? The way he presented in his own way. And there's so many beautiful, there's scenes in the Katamrita, Sri Ramakrishna Katamrita, the gospel, which was translated in the 40s, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, where Sri Ramakrishna seems to be saying this type of thing, but fleshing out this Shakta perspective, that Brahman and Shakti. It's not that Shakti is unreal and Brahman is real. Shakti and Brahman are the same, in that the absolute, the truth, is intrinsically dynamic. And I was hoping, Swami Ambikanandaji, if you can come in. I think Swamiji has been working on translating this important text. And there's a few scenes I was going to have him type them and send them to me. I'm going, better, you're more familiar. I'd read them badly, and maybe if you could read some of these verses that you think shed light on this aspect of Shakta teachings, perhaps, if you're there.
I'm here. Can
there you are,
hear me?
Swamiji. There you are. Sorry.
Okay. So so there's a scene in the first volume. It's in the second chapter. It's the boat ride with Keshab Sen. And so the Keshab Sen and his followers. And of course, Keshab, they were a Brahmo Samaj people. And so the Brahmo Samaj had a very, very particular view of God, formless, and they even would have to sign a vow. You became a Brahmo member that you would not bow down to idols, because that was not considered part of their theology. So anyway, so he's talking to, and so wherever Ramakrishna goes, he stirs things up. And of course, there's the added thing that Vijay Goswami, in this scene, they're on the boat on the ship, and they're in the cabin, and Thakur is sitting in the middle between Vijay Goswami and Keshab. And so Vijay Goswami had been a Brahmo Samaj member, but had split with Keshab for various reasons, and started a splinter group. And so right there, Thakur is always stirring things up and pushing buttons. But in this particular scene, this whole section of this chapter, he entitles it the the glory of Adya Shakti. And so in this fourth section, how M divides this whole conversation on the boat into a whole bunch of different subsections. And so in this section, M calls it the glory of Adya Shakti. And so this is volume 1, chapter 2, and this is the fourth section. And so Thakur says here, he says, the primal power, Adya Shakti, is playful. The word playful, the word playful is lilamoy. And so lilamoy, like Guruji was saying, like the term Shri, lilamoy, it's grammatically feminine in Sanskrit, but it's also considered a name for Devi. It's one of her many names, is she who is playful, she who is full of play. So he's using a very particular term. She's playful, but it's obviously it's she. The primal power, Adya Shakti, is playful. She is bringing about creation, preservation, and dissolution. Her name is Kali. Kali is Brahman. Brahman is Kali. They're the same thing. When she's inactive, not doing any work, no creation, preservation, or dissolution, when we think of this idea, then we call her Brahman. When she's doing all this work, then we call her Kali, we call her Shakti. The same person, and in Bengali it's Bhakti, or in Sanskrit it would be Vyakti, the same person, the name and form are different. And so this seems, as Guruji was saying, it seems very similar to what we've just been learning from these verses from the Devi Gita. And I don't know, there's actually Guruji, there's also a Guruji in that same scene. So in that same scene, so he's the same person, the name and form are different. And then he uses a famous example. It's like jal and pani. At a pond, there are 3 or 4 ghats, and ghats are steps in these reservoirs or ponds in India. There's they have 4 sides, and then there's steps that lead down to the water, and that's called a ghat. And so at a pond are 3 or 4 ghats. At one ghat, Hindus drink water, they call it jal. At another ghat, Muslims drink water, they call it pani. At another ghat, the English drink water, they call it water. These 3 are one. The difference is only in name. Some are calling her Allah, some God. He uses the English word God. Some are calling her God. Some are calling her Brahman, some Kali. Some are calling her Rama, Hari, Jesus, Durga. And so then Keshav, he smiles, according to M, Keshav smiling, and he asks Sri Ramakrishna, in how many ways is Kali playing? Please say some words about that. And so then Sri Ramakrishna says the different names, Mahakali, Nichakali, and describes some of them. And then he says, is it Shamakali? Because Shamakali's mood is mostly gentle. And she has a very long name. She who gives boons and fearlessness. Householders is very long in Sanskrit. Householders worship her in their homes. Whenever there's an epidemic, a famine, an earthquake, or a drought or dead, Raksha Kali has to be worshipped. So he's mentioning these different forms of Kali. And then Thakur says, when the universe is destroyed, there's the great disillusion. And then he says, then Ma gathers up and keeps all the seeds of creation, just like a housewife who has her pot of odds and ends, where she keeps maybe 5 different kinds of things. And then everyone starts to laugh. And then Thakur says, oh yes, housewives have that kind of pot. Inside are sponges, indigo pellets, little tied up bundles of cucumber seeds, pumpkin seeds, bottle gourd seeds. They keep all of these and take them out when they need them. After creation is destroyed, Ma Brahma-mayi. So the very name from the Tantric tradition is she who is, you could say she who is full of Brahman, Brahma-moyi, or she who in a certain sense, it's she who is Brahman, the same idea. Because she like Brahma-mūrtaye, śrī-brahma-mūrtaye, that's kind of that same idea. So after creation is destroyed, Ma Brahma-Moy gathers up and keeps all those seeds. After creation, Adya Shakti lives inside the universe. This is what Guruji was saying earlier. She gives birth to the universe and then lives within the universe. In the Vedas, there's the idea of the Urnanabi, the spider and its web. And that's in the Briharanyaka Upanishad. A spider brings forth the web from inside itself, then itself lives in that web. God is both the container and the content of the universe. And then that, then Thakur is still talking, but M has divided into a little, not only a section, but a subsection of the conversation. And that's where he uses the term M, uses the term Kali Brahman, Kali without qualities and with qualities. So normally we think of Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman, but this is Saguna Kali and Nirguna Kali. Mm-hmm. And so then, but Thakur is saying, is Kali black? From a distance, she's black. Once you're able to know her, she's no longer black. The sky from a distance is blue colored. You look up close, it doesn't have any color at all. The water of the ocean from a distance is blue. Go up close, pick it up in your palm and look, it has no color at all. And saying these words, drunk with divine love, Sri Ramakrishna starts to sing, is my mother Shama really black? The form of time and clad in the sky, she lights the lotus of the heart. And song so beautiful, I have it tattooed on my arm. Anyway, so that would, all that takes place on the boat ride. And then there's one more scene I wanted to share. This is that's chapter 2. So he's on the boat with Keshav and Vijay and all of the Brahmos. And then chapter 4, 2 chapters later, the mood changes. In the early chapters, in chapter 2 and 3, he's with these big groups. But now chapter 4, this is a very intimate group. And he's just a few devotees, M, and another person there is Vijay, again, the head of the splinter group. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very different mood to this conversation. There's a great scene, and I thought I'd share this. So he tells Vijay, as soon as you have her grace, says Sri Ramakrishna, you have her vision. She is the sun of knowledge. But by just a single ray of hers, the light of knowledge has illuminated this universe. Only because of this are we able to know each other and acquire so many types of knowledge in this universe. If just once she holds her light up to her own face, then her vision is attained. Sergeant Sahib, so Thakur uses this term Sergeant Sahib, and Sergeant Sahib means the night watchman. And so the night watchman would go around, keeping watch, but he had a lantern, but it was a particular kind of lantern that it had the back of it, and around the back it curved. It had it wasn't like a normal lantern. It had like a metal face on the back. So like our modern, battery powered flashlights, it would be directional. And so it had a little slit on the front that would just show the beam of light. So that's how he would look and how he would, check everything out at night. And so that's the kind of lantern. And so Sergeant Sahib, says Thakur, goes around at night in the dark, lantern in hand. No one's able to see his face. But by that very light, he can see everyone's face, and everyone can see each other's face. If someone wants to see the sergeant, then they have to pray. They have to say, Sahib, please just once turn the light on your own face, on yourself, just once, let's see. You have to pray to God. Lord, please hold the light of knowledge up to yourself so that I may have your vision. If no light is burning in the house, that's a sign of poverty. So you have to light the lamp of knowledge within the heart. And then he quotes another song, Shama Sangit, song to the Divine Mother. Light the lamp of knowledge in your home and behold her face, that of Brahma-Mayi. Again, that name for Ma, Brahma-Mayi. Yeah. So those are just two little sections I thought of when Guruji was translating these verses.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. She who is Brahman, right? And also by her light, she sees everything and we see everything. We don't see her, right? So one way you could think of it, perhaps to connect it to these verses, a loose connection, but is that by her power of ajnana, right? By avidya maya, right? We see this world, right? She sees this world, She creates this world, and we see this world. And by Vijamaya Shakti, or Jnana in this verse, right? Then what do we see? We see her, and the world disappears back into her, or like something like perhaps something along these lines, right? But very interesting, it's like, and also there, we can't forget the interpretation that they're looking at her when they say this, right? So they've seen her, back to Thakur's prayer, because they prayed to her. They wanted to see her, right? And she responded, right? We prayed to her. So Sri Ramakrishna said, actually, we should pray to Divine Mother to withdraw. I mean, he even used this type of language. Do not delude me by thy world bewitching Maya. That's one of the lines, right? In one famous prayer that he taught his disciples to say, do not delude me by thy world bewitching Maya. And M, later in his life, in the text called Śrī-brahma-mūrtaye, been translated, partially translated as M, the apostle and the evangelist, right? But he would quote that scene or that line all the time, and he'd rephrase it. He'd say, what he's saying, Ma, don't let me forget you. Don't let me forget you. Don't let me forget you. That is, do not delude me by thy world bewitching Maya. It's easy in this world. We see a world that's only her, right? She is the Virat, right? But because we don't see the Sūtrātma, we don't see the essence, we only see her as, because we see her as the world and not in her not the essence of the world, we don't see her. We forget her. We see only her, but we forget her, right? If we can see her, not forget her, and then maybe that's the purpose of sadhana. We practice remembering her and purify the mind by so doing, right? And then we see her, then we see a world or not see a world. We're seeing her, right? This is the problem. She hides as the world. And that's why there's a little bit of a danger. I often think that this is why I think tantric Advaita is, even Ramakrishna said this view, that the Vijnani view that the world, God has become everything, is the mature view, the final view, right? In the beginning, one thinks the world is false and God alone is real, but then the Vijnani understands that that God has become the world, including all living beings, right? That's the highest or higher form of knowledge, right? But that higher form of knowledge is also secret, in one sense. Started, it's not easy to get. This is the highest, this is the final stage, right? But it's easy to fool ourselves into thinking, oh, the world is God, right? And we should say, namo-virāṭ-svarūpiṇyai, the world is God. We see you as the world, right? But that next line, sūtrātma-mūrtaye, right? Rājju-sarpa-sragādivat, we worship you as the essence of the world, the hidden soul of the world. Because seeing the world pretending it's God, claiming, oh, we see this, the world is God. If you don't see the essence and you see the world and call it God, that some would classify that as materialism. We make a deity of matter rather than seeing matter as the deity. There's a difference, right? So there's a subtle danger, I think, in some form, some immature articulations of the view that the world is divine. The world is divine, right? But one has to see not only the Virāṭ-svarūpa, but also the sūtrātma-svarūpa, and understand that there is the namo-vyākṛta-rūpiṇyai, or the unmanifested. And all this is the glorious form of Brahman, śrī-Brahman, Kali Brahman. So I think that's a good, thank you, Swamiji. That's so nice to hear the Katamrita. Many of you know Swamiji's been working on the new translation, and these are beautiful verses. And I think this conversation with on the book was Keshav Sen, Vijay Goswami, and their followers. It's a public conversation, it's like but still such a clear articulation of this. He even titles it Kali Brahman, right? We underline this is, you take your big red marker and you circle the whole area. There's a lot of the argument for and presentation of this particular theological school, I think, is beautifully articulated, right? In a beautiful scene. So
one thing, it should be mentioned that part of the challenge and also the interesting dynamic is that in Bengali, the the third person singular pronoun has no gender.
Mm.
And some have even said it's more advanced than English in this way. There's no sense, there's no idea. Like in English, we have they, which can mean female or male. The singular word, there's no he or she or it. It's just one word. And so
What is that word?
the respectful is, well, there's three versions, but it's ini, uni, or tini. That's the respectful, very formal. And then there's the more informal, the she, o, a, and she.
Mhm.
But the point is that Thakur, and then so there's uni, ini, and tini, and Thakur uses tini so often in the Katamrita. And it's just basically the very honorific third person singular pronoun. But in other translations, they always will default when he's talking about God. They'll just, Ishwara, or whatever, they'll just simply use he with the capital H. But what happens is when you change those he's to she's,
Mhm.
it's a very interesting. So we have had for our default for this, when he uses tini, we default to she, and it really, really changes the mood. And very often here you'll see also, it's like when you do that, it's like in the very next example, he's using a term of like a mother with kittens, or like a mother has brought some fish into the house and she's going to feed her children. It's very often a motherly example that he gives. And certainly in this scene and there's lots of also contextual clues. Also, there's always the kind of the interpretive process one goes through in translating. You have to look at the sentence or the dialogue before, immediately after, the larger picture. And then of course, M is offering his own kind of subheadings like glory of Ajja Shakti and Kali Brahman, which definitely give clues as to kind of the point. And so that's kind of helped us to arrive at our choices.
Swamiji is not only Ishwara like that, but also a neutral or neuter term like Brahman.
Mm-hmm.
He uses tini. He uses that respectful,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
And
he often addresses the impersonal absolute or whatever we want as a Brahman, but in a personal.
that's the thing. He even
way.
says, and that's it. He literally says that there. It's pretty unequivocal where he says they're the same person. He uses
Yeah, he has a personal relationship with her. Because it's like our interpretation of these verses in the slide is because they're literally looking at her in the Devi Gita here. They just finished being overwhelmed by her, right? And so they're looking at her, right, as they say these verses. I think Sri Ramakrishna is also looking at her, right? Maybe physically or at least spiritually or some internal way, he's looking at her while he speaks all these things, right?
And it's interesting because out of all the different, he uses Bhagavan, he uses Ishvara, he'll use Kali, but the one he goes to the most, it seems, is simply tini, which is itself, again, it's honorific, but it's personal. And it has a definitely, and when you look at it in that way, and then in the larger context of Thakur's relationship with Kali, and also M, in later chapters, M will pretty much say just what I described when he's talking to Dr. Sharkar, and Dr. Sharkar says, oh, so he's a Kali Upasaka, and M corrects him and says, the Kali is something else for Sri Ramakrishna. And he has, the one that the Vedas declare as Brahman is the one he calls Kali, the one, and he goes down this whole list. That's the one that he worships as Kali. So all of these things lend themselves that when he's using this tini, there's a personal feel to it. There's a certain kind of intimacy. Yeah. And certainly when you translate it that way, as opposed to an it with a big I or something, it really, really, really changes the mood. And it's a very, very sweet.
And often it also changes the meaning. Not just there's subtleties of, it's like taking these verses can be interpreted one way or the exact opposite way, so by changing the meaning. by changing this the it to he to she, or the she or the he to she. It changed. There's some sweetness that comes out, of course, right? But also there's some theological points
Mhm.
that are easy, that we maybe have overlooked because of the way we found those words in our own language.
Mhm.
Jai Ma. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Swamiji. Are there any comments or questions on any and all these points?
Oh, Ron Molly and Cauliflowers had some questions. I
Okay.
don't know if Ron Molly, if your questions had kind of been addressed throughout the Ron Molly Ma.
Jai Ma.
Jai Ma.
This is beautiful. Swamiji, or anyone actually. I was when you were talking about, I kind of forgot my question, but when you were talking about the Vivarta Vada, so Vivarta Vada then has to involve some kind of modification, some kind of vikara, right? Like a superimposition, because then, can you address that? And then the other thing was, there are so many terms in Advaita, right? That so many terms and concepts. So if you can address the aspect of vikara, because to my understanding, then vikara is like a true, real kind of transformation. But then vivarta is, in some way, it's an unmanifest state. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll have to think about this, because these are technical questions, which I have to put my mind. I don't immerse for many years. I haven't immersed my mind in this particular argument that's given in Vedanta, right? So the terms and the subtlety of arguments not on my tip of my tongue. I shall contemplate it, and put my mind back on it, right? But the main in the if we were to define this perhaps as a Parinamavad type of school, that is that's the main distinction, is that the transformation is actual, right? That, and so generally they would say like that the transformation of Brahman into, like an evolution, something changes into something else, right? And in the more classical Advaitic system, that there's actually the change is not actual, it is only apparent, it appears to be, right? Then the question is, well, how does it appear to be, and whom does it appear to be? Where is that generated from? And that's a complicated question, and many people have argued against the school of Advaita based upon that. But sorry, you're waving your finger, something.
So that then leads to my second question, which is then, in the idea of avidya or ajnana, then Shakti is manifest in two forms, or there are two forms.
That's the point. She's appearing in this verse.
Anarjana Shakti and then the Vikshepa.
Yeah. So this is bigger. She's appearing as Jnana and Anjnana. Right. It's like, so that's another thing. Through her power of ignorance, she shows herself as the world. Through her power of knowledge, she dissolves the world back into herself. Right. So that could be from our perspective or from her perspective, but it's all her. She's doing it. Right. So I think that that's I think very important, that the primary, these are, and these can be traced back to, these are her Shaktis. Right. Thakur used that Avidamaya Shakti and Vijamaya Shakti. Right. But also we can say it's like that's a manifestation of Shakti, right? The primary Shakti. And in many schools of kind of sophisticated forms of tantric Advaita, they call that Swatantriya Shakti, right? That her primary, and why does she do that? How does she do that? She does it. It's the nature of consciousness to do that, to manifest, right? And it manifests as everything, and maybe the very of everything we call that ajnana, right? We see everything that's through her power of ajnana, or she creates the world out of her power of ajnana, and maybe that's the same thing. Her doing it and us seeing it, maybe the same thing. I think I like to blame everything on her, I give her credit to everything. That's why I like this verse, right? But so I think that Sri Ramakrishna would say, and actually that there's some opening beautiful verses in the first chapter of the Devi Mahatmyam that also describes by her power. She is the power of ignorance. She's the power of knowledge. By her power of ignorance, she throws everything into delusion. By her power of knowledge, she liberates people from illusion, right? But I think there may be a third state, and that maybe Sri Ramakrishna, maybe what Sri Ramakrishna means by vijnani, right? And ajnani, somebody who sees ignorance, sees a world full of ignorance due to ignorance. A jnani sees the one, right? And the world disappears, perhaps, right? But a vijnani sees the world and her, right? I think that's a very that's our target. Perhaps of course not everybody has their own target. We don't want to present and force a spiritual ideal on anybody, but that seems in Thakur's hierarchy, that's the final, or at least a beyond state, the vijnani, who sees the one who manifests as both jnana and ajnana. Ajnana disappears and one is established in jnana, right? Ignorance disappears and one's established in knowledge. A vijnani sees the one that's behind jnana and ajnana, right? Kali Brahman, the one who is both manifest and unmanifest, and the self of all, right? Like this verse says. I don't know if that makes sense, but it gets very technical, and actually we'll leave it. I don't want to. I'm not ready to jump too into the details, but this will be hashed out further, because in further chapters, the Devi herself will discuss all the things around 4 states of consciousness, where what does it mean? What is it that stops us from realizing her? What is the what are we lacking? What's lacking for realization and liberation? What is liberating knowledge? All these things would be talked, and it gets very technical, using the language of the classical Advaitic school, but I don't want to say the language of its enemy. It's not that I don't think these are enemies, right? But it uses it for a Shakta agenda, right? Which I think is interesting. But we'll go further into it, and I'll prepare a little bit and actually maybe you can remind me this, so I don't, because it will happen also. I'll jump into next week, and I always do, because there's always so much going on, and I'm not trying to not discuss it. I need to think about it carefully and to discuss it better.
Thank you so much,
Jaima.
Jaima.
Any other comments?
Guruji, I know it's super late, and I'm not sure if Sundarima and Atmaram are still there, but listening to all this, I keep thinking of echoes of Spinozian panentheism, and that idea of what is his Deus sive natura, that the God and nature are both a continuum of God. But I don't know if Atmaram, I don't know. I know this is something that I've been thinking of. I've been thinking if you could.
Maybe too late for Spinoza. I don't know. That's quite a.
It's never too late for Spinoza.
But yeah, Swamiji, he does. Swamiji brings up a great point that a philosopher in the Western canon, Benedictus Spinoza, he's often cited as sort of an analogy to these kinds of monistic trains of thought in Indic philosophy, seeing it kind of like an analogy. Probably the closest you get in the canon of Western philosophy. Of course, he was branded as a heretic. He was banned from the Jewish community in Portugal for heresy. So, that's always a great biographical detail. And part of it was his very radical idea that the substance of the universe, of the world, of all what he termed nature, is essentially a transformation, to kind of reference the Parinama-vada doctrine that Guruji was just talking about. What is a transformation, or as he called it, an attribute of God. So God, in his thought, God has infinite attributes, and space and time are the two that we know, that we have knowledge of, that we've experienced of. And so it's one of infinite attributes. So I think that's definitely a really good a citation that you bring up, Swamiji. It's definitely a lot of connection you could see there in a rough way.
We completely accept his theology. And we'll put his picture on our wall shortly.
Picture up. Well, by this giant thief.
We claim him as part of one of our lineage holders.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And, Elijah Bai, you have your hand up. Your digital hand.
I had my hand up before, but I've decided to put the digital one up too.
Oh.
It's okay. So it's right during our Q&A, Guruji, you mentioned just sort of evolution. And it's interesting. I'm currently taking a human bio course at my college. And we've been frequently after class, I'm talking to my teacher about things I see similarities in, like from going through our subtle anatomy course and seeing sort of that. And then just yesterday, we were talking, and we got to talk about, well, there's all this creation, right? And science, if science says that everything from what my previous misunderstanding was, that everything came from nothing, but in reality, what modern science says is that everything came from a single very small point of energy, right? And the question we were posing back and forth to one another is, there's all of this, right? And it seems to be that if there is that very small point of energy, what sparked it, right? And the thing that we both, I didn't expect this, but the thing we both agreed on was that thing could only be God, right? We couldn't think of anything else that could spark all of that, right? Which then it begs the thing that, well, if there's that, right, either that single point came out of God, or that single point is God, right? Which would mean that if that single point is God, then from that single point comes all the rest of manifestation, right? Is sort of what we came to. And to reference sort of, this is one verse I very commonly share when I'm talking to friends of mine about any of these sort of things. Sorry. Is this verse from the Devi Mahatmyam, Eka evaham jagatyatra dvitya kya mama para, right? I alone am here in this world. Who else is there besides me? Right? And I haven't experienced this, but I can say I firmly believe that. And I think that it's been very helpful to have this conversation tonight, just continue to dive into that idea. So thank you, Jai Guru.
Jai Guru, Jai. Excellent, excellent. No, it's also, we have to think this singular point that exploded into everything. Some of the texts will describe that within Ma, actually, there's trillions of such points flashing in and out of existence. Right? That she's not doing it. Everything's happening within her. In one sense, she's doing it, but with that, even just trying to think of that as the original point, it's a nice thought experiment. Of course, these are just romantic ideas of madmen, like we're gathering of madmen like this to think about these things, right? But that everything's happening within her womb. This is billions of such flashes and disappearances. So, but very beautiful. And that verse, of course, from the Chandi. This is the great tantric Mahavakya, right? Shakta Mahavakya. That she's the only one. I'm the only one here. And there's nobody else. Who else is there besides me? So that's a good if you want to take in a verse. Of course, there's a danger of taking something from one text and using that to interpret all other texts, right? Shankaracharya has made great line like this. I'll tell you it's told in all text by one verse. I'll tell you it's in every verse, right? And he denies the reality of the world by that verse, right? Right. So we can, if we were to be that bold and dangerous and reckless, we can interpret all of the verses in the light of this verse, right? And perhaps to just as much detriment. I don't know.
It wouldn't be such a bad thing, I don't
Well,
think.
it wouldn't be, but it could. There also we may lose some
Mhm.
important distinctions and philosophical views, but that's my tendency also. Who's my go-to stance.
Well, Michael, did you have a question?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Swami, if you'll entertain it. So in my understanding in classical Advaita, there's this idea that the ignorance is unreal. I had an Advaita teacher who'd say, well, and so how can it cause us any real doubt? And so we're already enlightened. And, sometimes people realize that they were, they realize that there's a self, and then they realize that they always knew it and they never thought anything else. But that's from the perspective that change is unreal. So if we're coming at this from this Parvata perspective, and we say that the changes are real and that change is part of the nature of reality, then what does that mean about ignorance? Does that mean that vidya and avidya are real?
Could, because when Sri Ramakrishna says that vidya, there's two shaktis, Vidyamaya Shakti and Avidyamaya Shakti. These are real shaktis.
Sorry,
Right?
I guess what I really meant was jnana and ajnana are real. That's what I mean. Is it like,
Yep. It gets this is probably more subtle than I can contemplate, right? But my take on it is that ignorance is not just a lack of knowledge; it's a thing. By her ignorance, Ma does not have a lack of knowledge in this verse, right? This is not you don't glorify the goddess by saying you don't know what's what, and that's what's caused the trouble, right? Ignorance, ajnana, is something she does, right, to show a world, to show herself to show her one being as a world, so that's a real thing, and here we are, right? And if we wake up and say, oh, there was never such a world, that's also her power. She does that too, and makes the world disappear, or makes her think, oh, I always knew I was a self, and there was never, whatever that mental state that would make somebody speak like that, right? That's also her action, right? Her power, her glory, That's how I would see it. It's not that Ma's in ignorance. It's her quality, right? And that's not a bad, and therefore it's not a bad quality, right? To say, oh, it's like, oh, by her power of ignorance, she creates, let's just say it like a more classical religion, more standard religious language. God created the world, right? So this is a verse that's describing from a particular philosophical perspective, right? How she does that to the power of ignorance. How we see a world, whether there's actually a world, or we see a world, so God created the world. This is how it's done, right? It's a real. We want to glorify her this way. This is what she does. Very interesting topic. Yeah.
Swamiji,
Tell me.
one more question, and just a comment. So I don't know much about the Advaita, but I've been reading up about it because I'm writing this paper. And so,
are you writing it for us?
Yes, I'm writing.
Okay.
For your
Okay.
class.
We'll see where you're going with this. I'll start grading you now.
But the question is, so there's Parinamavada, there's Vivartavada, and then
we have to make one statement that I've given very uncareful, irresponsible general definitions of these two schools. Right.
Okay.
You can be more careful, but I don't want to be more careful because that's a different class. So I'm being very, so that's it. Okay.
Then you're talking about creation and Shakti and Ma being this embodiment, this. illumined as well as the prabhav of this, right? Then there's the Parinamavada and then the Vivartavada, but there's also the aspect where they discuss there's no creation, Ajatavada, right? So, and that also is discussed when you're talking about these different aspects, right? And that concept of Ajatavada goes completely, it is contradictory in a sense, or is opposing to that, what Elijah said about, you know, that point or that one focal point where creation begins, right? Because in Ajatavada there is no creation.
Yes, no, that's why I didn't want to push back too hard, because I see the world very similar, not dissimilar to Elijah, right? And you know, like that great flash of creation, that's like, oh, that's Ma. You know, that's my natural tendency. You know, it's like whatever comes up is that we see Ma in that, and we see God in that, like that. But that's what I kind of hinted a little bit, that there's universes flashing out of existence, right? So whether or not Ma's doing that, whether God's doing that, take a giant step back, right? There's no creator there's no creator because creation is never happened. It is always, creation's always been there. There's a view, I mean, we have to back up a little bit because we haven't discussed this in this course, but there's views that there's no creator because the world always existed. There was never a time that did not exist, right? And will always exist, right? Therefore, when we say, oh, the creation, we're using the wrong language, because creation means that it from either create out of nothing or out of something or a exact moment, something like that. There is no such moment, and therefore there's no creator of that moment. But if we can still call, then maybe we mean by creation temporary existences or distinct existences of a world. And so in that sense, it's dependent on something, maybe not on an initial cause, a creative cause that made it happen, but there's we have efficient cause. We have all kinds of other types of causes. If you go to Aristotle's 4 to 6 list of causes, we exist because reality exists. So the reality or Brahman or Shakti or something like that is our creator in that sense, even though it never was a time that it started, right? So that's why I was the view of things, universes eternally coming in and out of existence, right? With never a founding moment, and therefore never a founding person, but a reality in which all that happens. That reality in which all that happens in the opening chapters of the Srimad Devi Bhagavatam, right? That's called Ma, right? She's the womb of reality in which time and space come and go, universes come and go, or eternally exist, manifested, unmanifested, without a creator, right? In the story, there's a creator, Brahma creates, and like, but he's not the real creator. That just comes and goes. He himself is dependent, and he's dependent on the world's created on Brahma. Brahma is dependent on Vishnu. Vishnu lies on the serpent. The serpent lies in the causal ocean. Where is the causal ocean? That is in the womb of reality. That is, whoever we want to put, whether or not we want to put a creating moment and a creator and a cause, the reality, the womb of reality, that also is called Ma, right? That is in the Devi Bhagavatam, that is addressed or conceptualized as the goddess, right? So the goddess we're worshiping, right? The goddess that, and that conception is inconceivable. Of course, I mean, we can say it, but they're just talking words, right? And ideas, right? But in the story, the poetry and the power of the story, try to imagine, and we're led to imagine the story. They're seeing that one, right? The womb of the universe, right? That somehow or another, out of devotion, out of condensation, out of illusion, out of imagination, whatever, some symbolism in the story, they're encountering it personally. And I don't think personally just because, oh, she's a person and a personal deity, and like that, personally as in like themselves, they're encountering that. And imagine what, I mean, try to imagine, we're encouraged to imagine the story, what that must be like. Their initial reaction is to lose it. They can't hold it, right? And then their next technique, go to the scriptures, what did the scripture, and then recite those verses, right? And these are the verses that help us understand that which is unimaginable, completely unimaginable. The womb of existence, which is dynamic. Anyways, super exciting, and bewildering. Right, there's a verse, actually I was going to bring it in, I forgot my book, the book it's in is in the back, in the office, the main office, that I was thinking, oh, this would be nice if we can learn it. It's a little difficult. The meter is a little difficult. It doesn't flow off the tongue, but I believe it's maybe believed to be written, one of these many verses that are attributed to Shankara, something like that, or maybe a South Indian saint. But it basically says that my description of my glorification and prayer, these prayers that I'm offering you, Ma, right? Or we can also say, this class I'm offering you, or the discussion we're having about you, right, is just completely non-different than the prattle of children, of infants, right? Like a little child prattling, mouthing, pretending to speak to, it's like being that that's intrinsically adorable. Take it as that, Ma, and accept that as my worship. Right, so we cannot think about these things. That's, to me, this is the exciting thing about texts like this, right? They allow us to babble on sweetly about something, to looking at the face of the Divine Mother, whom we cannot. It's impossible for us to understand, right? And with a little we can say, she may take it like this, even if it's said in Vedic Sanskrit, right, or in Western philosophy, or anything else, or in street poetry, or whatever it is, however you want to do it.
Guruji, I think Goa Vijay is embodying what you just said. I can tell.
Yes, I think so. He's in that mode. Yeah, he's our example. There he is. He's the spiritual ideal.
Yeah, and he is intrinsically adorable.
You shall not enter the kingdom. Or the kingdom. Hey there.
I get some cooing and weird noises, so.
Excellent. It's not that much different. The problem is, I mean, the only difference is, I can grade you on what I'm prattling. You have to. All right. It's getting late already. Here it's 9:20. We went way over, as we always do. But thank you for your kind attention and for listening to our prattle and for prattling together, right, as we look up into the eyes of the universe. All right. Jai Ma, Jai Ma, Jai Ma. Good night, everyone. All blessings. Ma. Going to the gathering mode. Who do we have left? Who's stuck it out? A few of us are here. Jai Ma, Elijah. Good night, Elijah. Alex G. Durga Dasi. Oh, did you do your reading group today, Giri? Or yesterday?
Doing it once a month, right?
Not once a week. It's once a month. Okay.
We did it last week on Tuesday.
Okay. So actually, we probably should mention, but they're doing a beautiful reading group on the Devi Bhagavatam, and maybe you can post it on our website or on the
the forum. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And we can, and those are interested, it's using ancient Christian monastic method of study, which I've actually, it's interesting because you're using that
Lectio Divina.
Thank you, Lectio Divina. I was actually thinking, oh, we wonderful one day to talk about that in our seminary classes, but
yeah,
not necessarily to do it, because that's not my method of. We all do our version of it, but that's systematized, but just to talk about ways of studying text and reading text. I'm thinking maybe how to bring it into the discussion of how to study, meditate on Shastra, right? So it's interesting that you've on your own are taking this text in that way. So it's a very
So we pick a random verse and then do Lectio Divina on the random verse.
Wonderful, wonderful.
We're also talking about Florilegia, so collecting quotes and making our own text.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's very nice also. Good. So if those are interested, it will be on the in the student group or some on the seminary page.
yeah, I'll
And,
post
or
it
you
up.
can go, or you can find Giri online, John Flicker on Facebook, and connect it with them that way, right? Or Durgadasi like that. So it's very, very. I listened to the recording, and I was very impressed and very satisfied with the way that is going to go, because also it allows also not only is it the meditative, contemplative way of studying, prayerful way of studying, but also some discussion. And our students, they're all bringing, all of you, I mean, are scholars in your own right in different ways, and bring different things to the discussion. So the ways of meditating on the text, historical nature of the text, and some of the, I was very satisfied to hear it. So
Very smart group.
yeah, very
You
smart.
did well, Guruji, in educating them all.
Yeah,
So.
no, I'm very, I didn't say I was proud, but I'm proud also.
We're proud
I'm
to
proud
have
of
you,
you, not
Guruji.
of me, because I didn't do most of that. You guys have, everybody has gone so much study on your own.
All
right.
the prepping is going somewhere.
Yeah.
Guruji, you're the mirror.
Hari Om Tat Sat. Good night.
Hari Om. Jai Ma.